Before starting this video, I do want to give a thank you to my patrons that support the channel. And if you would like to support the channel, there are some great benefits for you in the link down below. So with that, let's get into today's video. The Blind Eternities, the space between planes. There are worlds without end, and there's those who seek to consume them. Those are the Eldrazi Titans. Not much is known about their origin or how they came to be, however their forms manifest into alien-like monsters who seek to devour worlds. There are three distinct Titans of the Eldrazi. We have Ulamog, who is referred to as the Infinite Gyre or Ceaseless Hunger. This is due to the fact that Ulamog consumes all types of matter. Then we have Kozilek, who is referred to as the Butcher of Truth or the Great Distortion. This is due to the fact that Kozilek warps the landscapes of the worlds that he touches. And lastly we have Emrakul, who is referred to as the Aeon's Torn or the Promised End. She is considered to be the most powerful of the three Titans. Emrakul has a special ability to corrupt the minds and the bodies of the residents of specific planes. The Eldrazi warp and consume whatever plane they are on. With their brood, they consume plane after plane until there is nothing left. In this video, I want to share with you a guide to build around these monstrosities. There are many things to consider when building an Eldrazi themed deck. Especially with EDH, there is a lot of different options you can choose from. Whether you want to build a colorless deck with one of the three Eldrazi Titans, or if you want to use some other colors so that you could get some extra advantage getting your Eldrazi out. So the main goal and the purpose of this video is to help you and guide you through the process of making an Eldrazi deck, specifically which color combination you may want to choose from. So with that stated, let's now march forward with our Eldrazi army to desecrate the multiverse. The biggest impact you can make on your Eldrazi deck is picking the right commander. Depending on your playstyle, you might find one commander better than the other that I might be presenting today. Some of you may want to go colorless for that pure Eldrazi tribal theme. Some of you may also want to add a couple colors so that you could add in some nice ramp spells, also some protection for your Eldrazi. So again, to re-emphasize the purpose of this video, I do want to help and guide you towards the perfect Eldrazi commander for yourself. So first of all, I will go over some of the colored options, then later on I will go over some of the colorless options, and I'll give you some rough ideas of how you may want to build each of those commanders. So the first card I do want to bring your attention to when talking about Eldrazi Tribal is Savala Heart of the Wilds. A long time ago I did make a deck tech around Savala Heart of the Wilds with Eldrazi Tribal in mind. So if you do want to go check out that video, I'll post the link above here. But I would honestly say Savala is an absolute engine, mainly because when another creature enters the battlefield, its controller may draw a card if its power is greater than each other creature's power. So that does also include your opponents. If they play a big creature, they may get some card draw out of it, but most likely, because we're playing so many different Eldrazi left and right, we're going to be the ones that have most of the big creatures. She also does have a second ability, which is more impactful, especially because we want to be casting big Eldrazi left and right. You could pay a green and tap it, add X mana in any combination of colors to your mana pool, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So let's just say, for example, you have a 10/10 Eldrazi on the battlefield. You could tap her and pay that green mana so that you could add 10 mana in any combination of colors. I mean, we're really only going to be playing a colorless deck along with a green deck, so we're not really going to be tapping for any other color besides those. However, I will say green is very impactful for the Eldrazi tribe, mainly because you have mana dorks like Llanowar Elves, or you even have some ramp spells like Skyshroud Claim, where you could ramp into a big Eldrazi left and right. That's what's very nice about Savala, is because she's essentially just a big mana dork, making a lot of mana for your Eldrazi, but you also do have some other ramp options with them as well. What's also nice is you could play some of the Eldrazi cards that can't go into a colorless deck, but that could go into a color with green, like From Beyond. For this enchantment, it does provide a lot of value, mainly because at the beginning of your upkeep, you could put a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature token onto the battlefield. It has has sacrifice this creature, add 1 mana to your mana pool. So if you have this on the battlefield long enough and you have 4 or 5 Eldrazi Scion creature tokens on the battlefield, you could ramp ahead and put a big Eldrazi on the battlefield. They kind of act like treasure tokens but for colorless mana. And this also does act as a tutor for Eldrazi cards. So if there's a pesky enchantment on the board, you could search your library for Worldbreaker, for example. It's an excellent utility card. When you cast Worldbreaker, exile target artifact, enchantment, or land. It also does have reach, being a 5/7 body, so not too bad. And on top of that, if you do sacrifice a land, you can return it from the graveyard to your hand so that you can cast it again so you can remove some more stuff. I will say though, Savala is more known to be a combo engine, for example with Staff of Domination. Say for example you have a Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger on the board, and also you have Staff of Domination and Savala, Heart of the Wilds. You could tap Savala, Heart of the Wilds for 10 mana, then you could use that mana to dump it into Staff of Domination, untapping Savala, and then you could also untap Staff of Domination. Then you could repeat the process by tapping Savala for another 10 mana, and then continuously going back and forth until you have infinite mana, so to say. Then you could use the other ability of Staff of Domination to draw a card, untap Staff of Domination, then draw some more cards, continuously back and forth. So that way, since you have infinite mana and you drew basically your whole entire deck, you could find a win con from there. So I would say Savala is a very neat commander, mainly because it's a great mana dork for your Eldrazi so that you could spit them out left and right so that you could control the board. I would say another way you could play Eldrazi Tribal is by playing the classic commander Raktos, Lord of Riots. I will say what's very nice about Raktos, Lord of Riots is the fact that he has that ability. Creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. So that part is pretty convenient, but what's not convenient is that other casting costs. You can't cast Raktos, Lord of Riots unless an opponent lost life this turn. So Raktos, being the bloodthirsty guy he is, he needs to have somebody lose some life before he can come onto the battlefield. Luckily we do have some great pinging options like Mount Doom that has that pay 3 ability and tap it. Mount Doom deals 1 damage to each opponent, and on top of that we do have some other cards like Nettle Drone. So conveniently it is an Eldrazi, and on top of that it does have a great ability of tapping it. It deals 1 damage to each opponent. So outside of just trying to get Raktos, Lord of Riots on the battlefield, Nettle Drone is actually pretty powerful by itself. Let's just say for example Raktos, Lord of Riots and Nettle Drone is on the battlefield. You can tap Nettle Drone to deal 1 damage to each opponent. That'll make your spells cost 3 less to cast that are creatures. Then with that, if you cast a colorless creature, you could untap Nettle Drone, then tap it again so that you deal 1 damage to each opponent. Now your spells will cost 6 less to cast that are creatures. Then if you cast more and more colorless spells, you basically can cast all your colorless spells from your hand for free basically. So this is a great snowball effect. Most likely it's not going to happen all the time, but if you get that synergy, it may just happen for you in a game. And I'll say that's what's very cool about a lot of damage spells is they kind of act like rituals. Say for example Flame Rift, if you deal 4 damage to each player, your spells will cost 12 less that are creatures. Think about that for a second. Your Eldrazi are probably going to cost 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 mana to cast. And just for 2 mana, you'll be able to cast all the Eldrazi in your hand because of Flame Rift. Another card I would like to suggest for you is Blood for the Blood God. So essentially this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature that died this turn. That's pretty huge, mainly because that is 11 mana for just Blood for the Blood God, so being reduced is pretty helpful. And on top of that, you can discard your hand and draw 8 cards. Then Blood for the Blood God deals 8 damage to each opponent. Exile Blood for the Blood God. So not only do you draw 8 cards off of this, you will also deal 8 damage to each opponent, making a total of 24 damage, which in total your creature spells you cast will cost 24 less to cast. And then after all that, you could easily cast a endless one for being a 24/24. So there's a lot of ways to make Raktos a very viable Eldrazi commander. So I will say my cousin actually had a Raktos Lord of Riots deck, and he actually took apart it right away because he had one game with it where he actually got Raktos out on turn 2 somehow. Then on turn 3 he Flame Rifted everybody, then he casted all the Eldrazi from his hand, and he basically had like 4 Eldrazi on the battlefield on turn 3, which is pretty ridiculous by the way. So yeah, he easily won that game because he exiled a couple lands because there's nothing else on the battlefield besides land. People were actually developing up their boards and Raktos was on the battlefield, just accruing so much value. So if you do like the idea of reducing your mana costs of your Eldrazi, this is one way you could do that with Raktos Lord of Riots through the way of pain. So moving on to a different colored commander, I also did want to include Crewfix, God of the Horizons, mainly because he has that ability. If unused mana would be emptied from your mana pool, that mana becomes colorless instead. So this is the type of commander where you could store so much colorless mana left and right. You could have like 15 colorless mana just floating in the air just for the right time to cast Eldrazi. You could easily double that by having Forsaken Monument, especially when you tap a permanent for a colorless mana, you add an additional colorless mana. So I will say what's nice about Crewfix is the fact that he does have blue. So for example, if you do have mana drain in your deck, you could counter a target spell, then at the beginning of your next main phase, add an amount of colorless mana equal to that spell's mana value. So usually and typically people will counter a target spell with mana drain, but sometimes they don't use that mana after that. Luckily with Crewfix though, you have that ability to store all that colorless mana you just gained off of that mana drain. And if you do have a lot of colorless floating mana in your mana pool and you're not really using it for anything, you could use it into Deep Fathom Skulker. Mainly because, one, it does have that ability whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card, and on top of that it does have that pay 4 ability, target creature can't be blocked this turn, so that you could ensure some big Eldrazi can't be blocked so that they're swinging away for a lot of damage, or if you want to get a card draw, you're more than welcome to do that. But obviously the main reason why you want to be playing Crewfix is so that you could use all that mana to cast big Eldrazi spells left and right so that you could take over the game. So if you do like Simic, and if you do like ramping a lot so that you can play big creatures, Crewfix might be the great commander for you. But I will say one of the most classic commanders you could play for Eldrazi Tribal is Animar Soul of Elements, mainly because it's a small mana cost of just 3 mana of Temur colors. It does have protection from white and black, and whenever you cast a creature spell, you put a 1/1 counter on Animar Soul of Elements. Also on top of that, creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each 1/1 counter on Animar. So in a similar fashion to Raktos Lord of Riots, we're reducing the creature spells we cast by 1 mana for each 1/1 counter on Animar. So I will also say protection from white and from black is pretty relevant in most cases because single target removal usually comes from those colors. So in most cases, Animar is sticking on the board and becoming a bigger and bigger creature on the board, and so we could take advantage of that with card draw spells like the Return of the Wild Speaker. I mainly use it for the first ability, draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control. So if you do have a big Eldrazi like a 10/10 on the battlefield, you're drawing 10 cards, but if Animar is like a 20/20, you could easily draw 20 cards off of just Animar, and trust me, I've seen Animar become a 20/20 very easily. Technically with a lot of different combos, it could actually go up to a billion if you really wanted to. So just saying, Animar is a little cracked in my opinion. Speaking of combos with Animar, you could easily combo off with Ancestral Statue. Technically it doesn't have anything to do with Eldrazi, but having that ability to enter the battlefield, you return a non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand. So I will say that also does include itself, and on top of that, it is a colorless spell. So let's just say for example, Animar Soul of Elements has 3 1/1 counters on it. You cast Ancestral Statue for 1 mana, and then you return Ancestral Statue back to your hand. Now Ancestral Statue will be free forever now on, and then since it enters the battlefield, Animar will get a 1/1 counter on it, and then when you go back and forth with it, Animar could essentially become a billion. And if you do have something like Warstorm Surge on the battlefield, you could easily close out the game by pinging everybody to death. Or if you don't even have Warstorm Surge on the battlefield, you could swing in with Animar becoming a billion, and if somebody has a white or a black creature on the battlefield, and that's all the creatures that they do have on the battlefield, since Animar does have protection from them, you could go in, swing in at that person unblocked. But I would say the main reason why I do run Ancestral Statue is so that I could make my Eldrazi spells cost a lot cheaper. I will also say Animar Soul of Elements pairs perfectly with Cloudstone Curio and some other colorless creature spells. Cloudstone Curio has that ability whenever a non-artifact permanent comes into play under your control, you may return another permanent you control that shares a permanent type with it to its owner's hand. So let's just say there's a scenario in the game where you have Cloudstone Curio and Animar Soul of Elements on the battlefield with Ulamog. Let's also say Animar Soul of Elements has 10 counters on it. So what you can do is if you do have another Eldrazi, let's just say for example you have Kozilek Butcher of Truth in your hand, because Animar has 10 counters on it, Kozilek Butcher of Truth will basically be free. You could cast it for free, you could also draw 4 cards, and when it enters the battlefield, using Cloudstone Curio's ability, you could put Ulamog back to your hand, you could recast it because it is free off of Animar, you could destroy a target permanent an opponent controls, then with Ulamog entering the battlefield, Cloudstone Curio will trigger, you could put Kozilek Butcher of Truth back to your hand and drawing 4 more cards, You can rinse or repeat this until everybody has nothing on the battlefield, no permanents whatsoever, and on top of that, because you're drawing cards left and right with Kozilek, you can have a full grip over your opponents. The only reason why I bring up this combo is because I actually do have personal experience with it. I did have an Animar deck a long time ago, and I've used this combo left and right so that I could decimate my opponents with card advantage. So I will say, if you want to win the Eldrazi way, this is one way to do it. So I will say Animar Soul of Elements is not a new deck for Eldrazi Tribal because of that mana reduction you could have for your Eldrazi, but I will say there's a reason why people keep on going towards it. It's super powerful and it's very synergistic with each other, so that's why I had to give a mention to Animar. But if you do want to have access to all 5 colors, there's one way to do so with Morphon the Boundless. So yeah, he's basically the tribal commander for any tribal deck that's missing a tribal leader. Not that Eldrazi are missing a commander by any means, but Morphon will give you access to all 5 colors. So I will say what's very convenient about Morphon is the fact that you could choose Eldrazi when it enters the battlefield. On top of that, spells of the chosen type you cast cost WUBRG less to cast. This effect reduces only the amount of colored mana you pay. And also, he is an anthem for the chosen creature type that you choose. But obviously the biggest reason why you may want to consider playing Morphon is because you have access to all 5 colors, so you have access to counter magic in blue. Also on top of that, you have some great removal in white. Also, you have some great ramp in green, you have some damaging effects in red, and on top of that, you do have some great board wipes in black. So yeah, that's one big advantage to having all 5 colors. Also, another advantage is you can play multicolored spells like Sire of Stagnation or Herald of Kozilek. I named these ones specifically because Sire of Stagnation actually has a pretty good ability. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your opponent's control, that player exiles the top 2 cards of his or her library and you draw 2 cards. So this absolutely wrecks people who are playing fetch lands, or if they're ramping ahead, you could get some extra card draw and they'll exile the top 2 cards of their library. But I will say there is actually a pretty straightforward combo with Morphon the Boundless and also Fist of Suns. So essentially with Fist of Suns, you may pay WUBRG rather than pay the mana cost for spells you cast. And with Morphon, spells of the chosen type you cast cost WUBRG less to cast. They basically nullify each other so that you can cast spells for free that are Eldrazi, like Ulamog the Infinite Gyre. So I will say that's a pretty classic combo that you could run in Morphon the Boundless if you decide to make that commander. So with that said, now that I've talked about some of the colored commanders or multicolored commanders that you could run as Eldrazi commanders, I wanted to shift my focus toward colorless Eldrazi, mainly because that's what the Eldrazi are. They are colorless by nature. So as a deck builder, I do find colorless commanders to be kind of hard to build around because there's only so much things you could do with artifact ramp and colorless spells. But I did want to give an honorable mention to some commanders that are not necessarily Eldrazi, but that synergize with them very well. So those commanders are Liberator, Urza's Battlethopter, and the Peregrine Dynamo. So the main reason why I wanted to bring these 2 up is the fact they are low to the ground. Both of them are 3 CMC only. Liberator by itself has a crazy ability of having flash and flying, and also on top of that you may cast colorless spells and artifact spells as though they had flash. That by itself will give tremendous value in a reactive situation. It also does have that ability when you cast a spell, if the amount of mana spent to cast that spell is greater than Liberator, Urza's Battlethopter's power, put a 1/1 counter on Liberator. So in normal situations, you're casting a lot of Eldrazi spells left and right. Obviously their mana cost is going to be way bigger than Liberator's power, so Liberator is going to get pretty huge out of nowhere. Especially considering when you're casting a lot of Eldrazi spells at flash speed, you could be very reactive by casting like a Ulamog for example, so that you could exile a target permanent or 2 on someone else's turn. I will also touch on the Peregrine Dynamo. It's sneakily very good, especially with that haste ability, and also on top of that you could pay 1 and tap it, copy target activated or triggered ability you control from another legendary source that is not a commander. You may choose new targets for the copy. So if you really want to rub salt into the wound to your opponents, and if you're attacking with an Eldrazi with Annihilator, you could use the Peregrine Dynamo to copy that triggered ability so that you could get some more Annihilator triggers on your opponents. So I do know that could be very salt inducing, especially when people don't want to sacrifice their lands or their permanents. So I know what you're thinking, Annihilator isn't one of the most popular popular strategies in Commander, mainly because it could be very salt-inducing for specific opponents that have to sacrifice permanents. So yeah, just a fair warning, if you do play Annihilator in your decks, you may lose some friends out of it. So there's a lot of other abilities you could copy with the Peregrine Dynamo. That was just one example that I thought of. Of course, Annihilator, the most evil one that I could think of. However, I want to shift my focus to probably the best Eldrazi tribal commander that's in colorless, in my opinion, because I actually play Kozilek the Great Distortion myself. I will say there's also some other colorless options like Emrakul the Promised End and also the new Zuladoc Void Gorger. However, with Kozilek the Great Distortion, I find him to be pretty powerful, mainly because he could refill your hand with that ability when you cast Kozilek the Great Distortion. If you have fewer than 7 cards in your hand, you draw cards equal to the difference. Say for example you only have 1 card in your hand, you're just going to draw 6 more when you cast Kozilek. I will say just by those standards alone, this makes a great colorless option, and on top of that he does have Menace. And also another ability he does have is discard a card with converted mana cost X, counter target spell with converted mana cost X. Also, not to mention, he is a 12/12 with Menace, so if he swings at an opponent and if he only has 1 creature, he'll deal 12 damage to an opponent. Then if he swings at that opponent again with 1 creature, he could basically take out that opponent with commander damage. So again, I know he is 10 mana, but he does have an array of abilities of drawing you cards, and on top of that, he's pretty hard to block. You have to have 2 creatures to block him, and he's a 12/12, so he could be a potential win con in the command zone, and on the board he could be a great control piece depending on if you have the right cards in your hand. You could counter spells left and right. Also, I don't know if I've mentioned this already, but Kozilek is my favorite out of the 3 Titans, so I will say I am a little biased towards that. So now that I've talked about some of the colorless commanders you may want to consider playing, I did also want to talk about colorless staples, because if you're playing a colorless deck, you probably need a way to keep up with some of the other decks in the table where they have multiple colors. So I will say there are some great ways we could get Eldrazi out on the battlefield pretty quickly. So for example, we do have Urza's Incubator, Eye of Ugin, Shrine of the Forsaken Gods, and Eldrazi Temple. So what I do like about Urza's Incubator and Eye of Ugin is the fact that our Eldrazi spells will cost 2 less to cast, and on top of that, with Eye of Ugin, it has that pay 7 ability and tap it. Search your library for a colorless creature card, reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. So if you do have a lot of mana on the battlefield and you're just waiting to get a big Eldrazi, you can search your library for one. I also do like having the idea of Shrine of the Forsaken Gods and Eldrazi Temple in the deck, mainly because instead of tapping 1 mana, we could tap 2 mana to cast Eldrazi spells. So of course we want as much mana as we can so that we can cast our Eldrazi spells. These are just some ways we could get that extra ounce of mana so that we could cast them. The next card I did want to mention, and I already kind of mentioned already, is Forsaken Monument. So for 5 mana, colorless creatures you control get +2/+2, and whenever you tap a permanent for a colorless mana, you add an additional colorless mana, and on top of that, whenever you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life. So I don't think I need to explain how good this is in the deck. It's a great anthem for your colorless creatures, giving them +2/+2, and on top of that, because we do have a lot of colorless lands in the deck, and for each colorless land we do tap, they'll get an additional mana on top of that. That's going to be absolutely disgusting. I will say though, whenever you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life. That could be pretty relevant in some instances. Say for example, a lot of your opponents are playing aggro strategies and they're beating you down left and right, and you haven't cast an Eldrazi to protect yourself. This will be a great buffer, so when you do cast colorless spells, you'll gain 2 life for each colorless spell you do cast. So I will say there is some value in that. So I will say this, in a colorless deck, there's not really a lot of great interaction you can be playing, but there is some that you can be playing. Not of This World is pretty excellent. So this does have the ability counter target spell, or an ability that targets a permanent you control, and this could potentially be free if you have a creature with power 7 or greater. You do also have some great board wipes with All Is Dust and also Calamity of the Titans. So if your opponents are getting too ahead of themselves, say for example they have a huge army on the battlefield, you could use one of these two to wipe the board clean. Another way we could interact with our opponents is by using new cards from the new Precon set, Desecrate Reality and Rise of the Eldrazi. Both of these have incredible effects. Desecrate Reality has that ability for each opponent, exile up to 1 target permanent that player controls with an even mana value, and if you do fulfill that adamant ability, you can essentially return a permanent card with an odd mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield. Also, by the way, this is at instant speed, so you can do this at any time you want. But I will say, I do like Rise of the Eldrazi, mainly because it represents 3 of the Titans in that text. The spell can't be FP counter, destroy target permanent like Ulamog, target player draws 4 cards like Kozilek, and take an extra turn after this one like Emrakul. So I thought that was pretty neat having each of the Titan's ability into one card. However, I did want to discuss with you another option that you may want to consider having in the deck, like Ugin the Spirit Dragon and Ugin the Ineffable. Ugin the Spirit Dragon is a classic control all-star. It has that ability of dealing 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. It's also a great board wipe for its -X ability, and its -10 ability is basically a game winner in most situations, especially if you put 7 Eldrazi on the battlefield. I will say I also do like Ugin the Ineffable, mainly because colorless spells you cast cost 2 less to cast, so all your Eldrazi will cost 2 less to cast. And on top of that, it does have a -3 ability, destroy target permanent that's 1 or more colors. And I guess also he does have that +1 of making a blocker for Ugin. So I would say both Ugins are definitely worthy includes in any Eldrazi tribal deck. But I will personally say some of the best cards in your deck are actually from the Lord of the Rings set with Palantir of Orthanc and the One Ring. The reason why I consider these one of the best cards in the deck, mainly because Palantir of Orthanc has that ability at the beginning of your end step, put an influence counter on the Palantir of Orthanc and you scry 2. Then target opponent may have you draw a card. If that player doesn't, you mill X cards, where X is the number of influence counters on the Palantir of Orthanc, and that player loses life equal to the total mana value of those cards. So let's just think about it this way. You have a lot of Eldrazi in your deck that are 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 mana costs in the deck. So more often than not, Palantir of Orthanc is going to give you more card draw than milling you. Even if you get milled, you might take out a player by milling a lot of Eldrazi into your graveyard. So either way, it is going to be a win-win for you no matter what. Also with the One Ring, I don't think I need to explain this as much because of how powerful and stupid it is. It does have indestructible and you gain protection from everything until your next turn if you cast it. But then after that, you'll snowball into so much value by tapping it, putting a burden counter on the One Ring, then drawing a card for each burden counter on the One Ring. Let me tell you, I know you're going to lose a lot of life out of this, but you're going to be drawing so much cards out of this, it's going to be absolutely ridiculous, especially the longer the game goes on. So again, I don't think I need to explain this one as much because it is pretty powerful by itself. So with that said, those are the main things I did want to discuss with you, talking about colored decks and colorless decks you may want to consider running for your Eldrazi themed decks. So let me know down below in the comments who is your favorite Eldrazi tribal commander. So the main reason why I decided to make this video is mainly because of the new Commander Master set coming out, especially with a pre-con deck. I will say in the next couple days or so, I will be coming out with a pre-con upgrade for the new Eldrazi Unbound deck. So if you do want to go check that out, there might be some things that I talked about on here that will be on there as well. So make sure to check it out. So with that said, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And with that out of the way, thank you for stomping by.